Hello and welcome to What's Up, episode 0, I suppose, as I haven't decided if this is going to be a thing yet. I think it probably is. This is a podcast with me, your host, Wat Fanar. Currently, nobody else. It is just me. And yeah, I attempt to answer what's been going on in my mind for the last week. Let's start off with how have I been doing emotionally. Obviously, I've been going through a lot right now. I've been, for those of you who don't know, though I assume most of you do by now, I have been working for Nerdcubed since the beginning of the company. In fact, before it even was a company, and I have now been recently made redundant from that job. I don't think I'm allowed to say too much more than that, but yeah, I've been trying to handle it as best I can and trying to make the most of the opportunity. I'm now trying to work on my own games and see how I can develop. So I'm mostly staying positive. One of the best things to come out of this is I've kind of got my best friend back. Basically, my best friend, Dan Hardcastle, and I have barely spoken for the last few years, just because every time we have spoken, it's been about work, and there's been so much stress in the company that I think just the two of us being able to just have nice casual chats just we haven't had that opportunity, and we've honestly sent more personal messages in the last few weeks since the redundancy has all been worked out than we have in the last year. So it's actually been really nice from that side. But yes, me having to move on means that I've got to work out what my next move is. And because it was also nice this week because I got so many great messages from presumably all of you guys listening to this now, and the other Nerdcubed fans. I don't know if we still call them procrastinators. Since Matt took over the community, I sort of have been a bit down a hole with blinkers on. But yes, so everyone's been very nice and very supportive, and lots of people were asking if I'd want to do a Patreon, and I hadn't really ever thought about it. I mean, I had thought about it, and my thought had been, I don't need a Patreon. Mostly because I was being funded by the Nerdcubed Patreon. So it would be a massive insult to Dan and everyone else for me to have my own Patreon. Obviously that's no longer the case, so that sort of main reason for not doing it has gone. And then I had been thinking about just making this video game, and I kind of felt a little bit bad asking you guys to help fund the development of this game, because really it just feels like bad business practice to me. My general response is like, if Square Enix suddenly came down and said, hey, could you just generally fund us, and and then our video games will come out whenever we feel like it. I feel like that's bad business practice. However, the more I started to think about it, the more I realised I was going to miss interacting with an audience outside of games, and I know that Dan runs his own sort of podcast for the Patreon, or for the Nerdcubed Patreon, and so because of that, I thought maybe I could actually do some of these things, and I came up with a list of things that I'd like to do, and then I realised I am awful at following through with things. So I had great ideas. Like, I would love to do really in detailed toy reviews, and at some point that may still happen. I have good, strong feelings about that, and I think that that would be a really cool thing to do. The thing is I'd have to put effort into it, and if I have to put effort into it, then it's going to distract from the gaming side, which is what I think is my future right now. And it's also going to distract from, just if it's something that requires that amount of effort, it's also something I will put off and then become another one of those projects I start and never finish. So I ended up sort of taking what I've learned from things before to try and make this as simple as possible. So I decided that the podcast is something that I could do. So basically what's going to happen is I'm going to sit down every night, ramble on for about anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour, and my personal goals are everything has to be in one take, more or less, and then I'm going to shove all of those daily sections together into one nice big long podcast. The reason I'm doing that is because I don't want to, if there isn't anything particularly interesting that happens on a day, then I don't want the pressure of that having to be uploaded. So I can skip a few days and still have a weekly podcast, and we'll see what happens. I'm going to try and include a little bit of everything in my life. So some of it will be reviews of games and films and TV. Some of it will just be random thoughts I had. And the last section is it will be in general news and me commenting on the news. Probably more nerdy news than actual real world news. I try to pretend the real world doesn't exist too much. It's not good, but it is what I do. So this is a test. This is a test to find out whether or not I can make this. And so far it's been going really well. Just for reference, I'm recording the entrance section and the final section after I've recorded the daily section. So I've already done the 3 days of recording, so this is going to be a short week, but I wanted to sort of get it out there so that you guys could work out whether or not you liked it or not. And yes, because I'm recording this section first, like I can tell you, it's been going really well. I really enjoy being able to sort of vent my thoughts out at the end of the day, and I think there's some good content in this episode. So let's finish off this introduction with what's in this podcast. We have my discovery of an investment opportunity, which is mostly going to be a chat about franchise-based board games, and ones which are, at the moment, either on Kickstarters or those sorts of things. And that, I'll talk more about that in that section. I'm also going to talk about the news. As I said, there's going to be a news section. And then I'm also going to do a review of the new mobile game, Chain Strike. So, that's what we've got, and let's get started. So next I'd like to talk about some news, some news that happened during the week. Let's start off with, I think for me this is sort of one of the biggest pieces of news. The Deadpool animated series it hasn't technically been cancelled, but pretty much everyone has dropped out of it. Like, so far, all we knew about it was it would have Deadpool in it. It was being written by Donald Glover and his brother, Stephen Glover. That, for me, was probably the biggest selling point, was it was going to be a mature cartoon written by Donald Glover with Deadpool, and it was going to be on FX, or maybe FXX, one of the FX type things. And I was really psyched for that. I think Donald Glover is a very funny person. I think that Deadpool lends himself to an animated series and a sort of mature comedy series. And I thought this might be another one of those steps towards more mature animation, because we do have a big thing about sort of as soon as things get animated, we sort of assume that they're for children, and Japan does a great job with anime of being able to have animation for drama and for comedy and for pretty much anything. And the only thing that we're allowed animation for, if you're a grown up, is comedy. Like, it has to be funny. There's no sort of drama or sci-fi. And because being able to do those things drops your budget, like, it's a lot easier to animate superhero shows than it is to do all of the visual special effects. And so, because we don't have that market, we're really cutting ourselves off onto the sort of stories that can be told on television. I mean, admittedly, Game of Thrones probably should be animated, and they somehow managed to pull that one off with just getting big budgets. But as the BBC will tell you, not everything is Game of Thrones. In fact, very little is. So if you can't get that big sort of success, we need more animated shows so that we can start getting more of these things. And I don't know, maybe Deadpool wouldn't have been a huge step in that direction, but it would at least be a little bit more of a step. I want to see more adult animated stuff. But yeah, the writers, one of the main reasons I was interested in it, are no longer part of the show. And at the same time, FX has dropped out of it, meaning we might still get a Deadpool animated series, but apparently Creative Differences was a 3-way split or something. I don't know. There's a small chance that maybe Disney has basically stolen the rights because they want to put it on their streaming service. So that might have been it. But I think if they were doing that, they'd have grabbed Donald Glover. I don't know. I have no idea what's going on there. It's just a real pity. That's something that would have been really nice and just didn't happen. So yeah. Well, moving on to other superhero news. Apparently, in fact, animated superhero news. Apparently, people... I couldn't find out who is actually doing it, but someone is making a Spice Girls superhero... I think it's animated movie, but it could be animated series. Yeah, it's just... I don't understand this. I do understand that we need more female superheroes, but basing it on the Spice Girls just seems like a weird choice for me. I don't really have anything to say other than just apparently this is a thing. I'm not predicting it to go very well. In fact, it's only saying that they're going to be based on the Spice Girls, so, you know, it might not even be the actual Spice Girls turning up. And that makes it even more of a weird decision. Especially because it's not like the Spice Girls are a current entity. I don't know. Maybe the existence of this is sort of an attempt to be the Ready Player One, to have that sort of 90s references when there was a lot more superheroes and Spice Girls. I don't know, maybe that's the only way I can see it working. Yeah, pretty lost on that one. Well, speaking of classic British things and stars who almost definitely won't turn up, Christopher Eccleston's been doing the rounds of lots of news shows and talking about finally talking a bit more about sort of his time on some of the franchises that he's worked on. Most importantly, being Doctor Who, which. So I have mixed feelings about Christopher Eccleston. So, because on like one hand, he did do a good job of playing the Doctor, and he does appear to be a pretty talented bloke. But on the other hand, and I'm aware that he probably sees himself as more of a thespian, and I only know him from his more mainstream work, but he doesn't seem to have any loyalty. Like, I haven't really seen him do anything where he's done more than one season of a thing or more than one movie of a thing. And like that really starts to stick out. So even though he's sort of making the comments of sort of, oh, I got screwed by Doctor Who, you do have to question sort of for a person who's like, oh, I hate working on these things, and you're like, why do you keep doing it? Because he did Doctor Who, and then straight after Doctor Who, he had to go to Heroes, and then he refused to come back to Heroes as well. Then he ended up doing G.I. Joe, which he hated. I think he described it as sort of being suicidally painful, which you really question why he did it, but he says it was for the money, which I suppose I can just about understand. But yeah, he then refused to turn up. Like, he is one of the only people killed off in G.I. Joe 2 off screen. Like, pretty much everyone else turns up to be killed off. And like, there were some big names who turned up for just the first 10 minutes of that movie so that they could be killed off and the new guys could take over. It was kind of an interesting thing that they did, but yeah, Christopher Eccleston is one of the few where they're like, oh no, he won't get out of this frozen tube. Oh well. And then sort of after having had that really bad experience, he decided to work for Marvel in Thor, to which, first my question is, why on earth did he do that, considering he already knew the sort of idea of what happens when you work on a project like that? And secondly, I still have no idea how Marvel ever decided that they wanted to commit to an actor who categorically refuses to turn up in things. Like, he's never turned back up in Doctor Who, despite having requests to turn up for like the 50th anniversary. He didn't turn up again in Heroes, and Heroes has had a lot of people who were only small parts turn up time and time again, so I don't know that he was offered the option to come back, but it surprises me that he didn't come back, because he easily could have. There are just, yeah, it's just, he seems to have this track record of not turning back, and Disney, by this point, with Marvel Studios, was certainly knew that most of their characters they wanted to keep bringing back, and they knew that these characters were going to reappear, and admittedly, Christopher Eccleston is probably, his Dark Elf character is probably one of the pretty low on the list of characters they're going to want to bring back, but not having the option by not having hiring an actor who you know isn't going to work with it just seems weird. But yeah, so he seems to have hated all of his career, or all of the bits that actually made him money. And then on the other side, so his view on sort of what happened with Doctor Who was he felt like the BBC sort of demonised him, which they kind of did, because the BBC were like, he left because he didn't want to be typecast, and that was not the reason for him leaving. It turns out he was leaving because he didn't like playing. I think he didn't like the mentality of what he had. From the sounds of it, he just started not getting on so well with people, and I don't think it's really hard because I'm only seeing this from his perspective. I've only got the talks from this perspective, but it sounds like he was getting on less well with Russell T Davies, and he's sort of making comments about sort of not really liking to work with Billy Piper, not because Billy Piper wasn't any good or unpleasant, but because at the time, this was really Billy Piper's first acting role. Before this, she was a pop star. In fact, linking it back to our previous topic, I think one of the earliest pieces of footage of Billy Piper is her at school, because I think she went to the same performing arts school as the Spice Girls or something. And there's sort of let's look at the school that made the Spice Girls, and there's a group of girls trying to pretend to be the new Spice Girls, and one of them is Billy Piper going, "Oh yeah, I really want to be a Spice Girl." So she really came from the pop star background, and this was one of her first acting roles. And so, obviously, having your main co-star be someone who is very new to any industry is always going to be hard work. And I think that was sort of more of his problems, and not necessarily with her final performance, but just how fresh she was, and therefore how much that was taking out of him. I also think he didn't like being funny. But, yeah, just seems weird. I suppose we now have a little bit of an answer to that. Yeah, it just feels like there's always so much more to that story that I don't know. Well, moving on to other old sci-fi shows with a recent comeback. Star Trek Discovery had a final deleted scene that's recently started popping up on the interwebs. And it depicts a character. I'll try not to use spoilers. So it depicts a character who at the end of the series is left sort of in a, where on earth does that person go? And it shows them being recruited by Section 31, which is a sort of an interesting creation by Deep Space Nine. And I'm not even sure it was one of the good creations of Deep Space Nine. So it's kind of nice to have a little bit of closure on that particular character, but I think the thing that really jumped out to me was how different I started thinking about what Discovery was and how much better Discovery would have been if it had been a story of Section 31. Because Section 31 in the Star Trek universe is supposedly sort of the Black Ops top secret section of Starfleet who does the stuff that needs to be done. And particularly the way that the show starts. Okay, I'm going to have to spoil the first 2 episodes. But basically, Michael Burnham... Oh my god, Bo! Sorry, every time they use Michael Burnham's full name, which is a lot in the show, I hear the Bo Burnham song, where it goes, Mr. Burnham, Bo, oh my god! Yeah. So Michael Burnham faces a court-martial, and because she attempted to attack a Klingon ship instead of being peaceful and keeping negotiations open. But she was doing it so that because the Klingons respect strength rather than respecting diplomacy. So it wasn't a, let's start a war, it was a, look, this is the only way that they understand it was as a diplomatic move. And the idea of her being dishonorably discharged and then taken, being offered the job of like, you are going to a prison colony, or you can become a member of Section 31, would have been interesting. In particularly, it would be interesting because the show wanted to take a darker sense of things, because TV shows in general have got a lot darker than classic Star Trek. And the thing about Section 31 is it's categorically about people who will do things that you're not supposed to do in Starfleet. So the whole show could suddenly become, this is a darker show, and we're going to question at what point does this show stop being Star Trek? Because, or in the show, it's when are we no longer Starfleet? You know, how much can we justify in the name of helping Starfleet, and how much is because Section 31 doesn't follow the code of conduct of Starfleet, and it's like, how many of those rules can we break until we're no longer Starfleet at all? And I think that would have been a really interesting ethical question, and particularly one that they could have run with a much darker theme, but in universe have sort of a, look, the reason we're running this is because we want to do this dark part, the part that the almost unknown part of the Star Trek universe, and we're actually using what they were kind of inevitable, like, I mean, the Orville did manage to do what I'm just going to say was sort of impossible, in that the Orville did have a light tone, but really we do expect much darker TV shows now, and so I feel like they were inevitably going to have to make it a little bit more gritty, and they were going to have to paint a slightly darker view of the universe. And if they wanted to do that, this was, this is a place where they could do it and then actually question whether our need for these darker parts of the universe, whether or not those are real or not. And then particularly because it's sort of like Black Ops, and no one talks to anyone, you'd have a whole series filled with double agents and twists and turns, and you could make a good series out of it with sort of different groups inside Section 31, different factions of Section 31 trying to fight for control, some who were more idealistic and some who were more all of the means are justified so long as they get the right results. Yeah, I think that would have been a much more interesting way for the show to go, and for it to take one of its bigger problems, which is it wanting to be a darker and more mature show, and turning it into an asset. But alas, that is not what happened. So, talking of classic TV shows going in a darker direction, there was a really interesting... So there's a video trailer for a comic book, and it's for the Power Rangers comic book. So they're currently running an event called The Shattered Grid, and they've actually filmed a small video trailer for it, and it's really good. I have to be honest, I haven't been following the comic. I am vaguely aware that they're doing a sort of mirror universe where where the Green Power Ranger takes over, and from what I've seen, I really love all of the art that they've done. they've sort of changed how the Power Ranger suits look so that they're much bulkier and more armor-like. And they even made the main character, who is this sort of the Green Ranger, but they actually mixed his green and white suits together. There's some really interesting sort of... You look at it and you definitely know it's the Power Rangers, you know the reference material, but they've also done a really good job of making it feel much more... it doesn't feel like people in spandex, which of course is what the Power Rangers were. It's the sort of thing I would have loved to have seen them make a movie of, as opposed to the movie that they actually made. On top of that, like I just don't have the interest in Power Rangers. Power Rangers is one of those things where you look back on it and you're like... and I look back on it with fond memories. I was a huge fan of it as a child. But I have occasionally gone back and tried to rewatch Power Rangers, and it does not age well. And I don't think it's actually the age. I think it's just the general maturity of it. It's very much... some things are made for kids and some things are made suitable for kids. And I think that Power Rangers is one of those which is sort of made for kids. And I'm well aware that it is based on a Japanese series which is not really entirely aimed for kids. It's sort of... but Japan has a very different cultural level of things. And I don't know... I've never watched the Japanese series, so I don't know how much of the our version is a perversion of the Japanese version. I don't know how realistic it is. But yeah, this trailer looks great, and they've made 3D versions of everything. They actually got the original actor of the Green Power Ranger to turn up for their trailer. So if you're a Power Rangers fan, search for the official trailer for the Power Rangers Shattered Grid. It's pretty cool. It's only a few minutes, but it's worth watching. Speaking of sort of things going dark and sci-fi shows, and trailers in general, Netflix show The Titan has released its first trailer. It seems to be about genetic modification, and I think that's a really cool subject that hasn't really been dealt with very much. So I'm actually quite interested to see how that goes. It does, however, look like they're going a little bit in a thriller direction, so there is, I'd say, at least a 50% chance I will not make it through the entire series. But it comes out at the end of the month anyway, so I'll try and talk more about it when it does come out. But yeah, that is an interesting trailer if you're interested. So, a new version of the Mutant Ninja Turtles. Sorry, my brain doesn't... The English version always had heroes, and it's... Anyway. Yes, that thing is having a new show, and this looks like it probably is sort of in the made for kids and probably not as good for adults, and it looks kind of cool, but at the same time there's definitely a lower production value on the animation. It's got a sort of mildly above Flash animation kind of feel to it. But the reason I really wanted to bring it up is because they've renamed the Turtles, and I think this is this isn't... So instead of being called Raphael, Donatello, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, they're called uh, Mikey, Donnie, Ralph, and Leo. And it's not that those are necessarily wrong, but because I think this is one of the few times that I've actually learnt something by watching a kids' cartoon. And because the names are actually names of famous artists, part of uh, the pre-Raphaelites, the Raphaelites, something like that. Anyway, I like this. I think that we should put more effort into accidentally teaching kids things. I mean, for example, we regularly have these things where you're like, oh, I can name, like, as a kid, I could name all 151 Pokemon. And I could name, at best, 20 elements on the periodic table. And you're like, if only I could have mixed those skills together, that would have made life better. And so I feel like this sort of dumbing down of the names I find frustrating. Mostly because it wasn't like the whole thing was about painters. It was really just a reference for from the Splinter, who sort of was like, I like these painters, I will name them after them. And really, the whole... we as people are not named by ourselves, we are named by our parents. Except for me, I changed my name. So I was named by me. But I feel like there is just that sort of... it said something about who Splinter was, that they had those names. And I think that sort of said something about where they came from. I'm not going to criticise them for any of their other choices. Like, that's fine. They had to evolve a series, and that makes sense. I just feel like we were slightly teaching kids something, and now we're not. Alas. I can't remember what my segue was for this, but anyway. Lego news. Probably something to do with kids. I mean, the segue would have been sort of, speaking of kids things. So the new Tron sets have come out for the Lego Ideas program. I'm going to be honest, I am not the biggest Tron fan. I think it looks amazing, but I tried watching the first movie and it really struggles. Firstly, tonally, this is a sort of movie before we'd really got to non-linear editing, which meant the films are just so slow paced. Secondly, I'm not a huge fan of the concept of the show. There are little bits and pieces of it that are very nice, and the visual style is wonderful, but it does get boring after like 2.5 hours. I think Tron Legacy was mildly better, but I don't think it was actually good. And so, yeah. But the sets kind of do look cool, and I do like the... they have sort of a special backpack piece where it has one of those sticky out bits which you can sort of put things on and they spin round, so that the I think the main character, I think his name's Tron, because he has two of those wheels, two of those discs that clip onto his back, so he has sort of a thing sticking out. But it's a standard peg that or a standard one of those Technic connectors, so you can actually attach a lot of things onto the back of a person with that, which seems cool to me. I don't know if that's a thing that we've had before, because I'm not as much of a Lego nerd as I should be. And then also, kind of on Lego news, Lego has announced that the this is really our transition into video game news, because the Lego Incredibles game is going to come out around summer, roughly or pretty much the same day that the new Incredibles film comes out. And speaking as a fan of Lego games and the Incredibles, I'm not looking forward to this at all. I feel like Lego games only work when there are lots of characters in them. Like, Lego Marvel is really good fun, and in some regards, Lego Dimension kind of works. It works in theory anyway. It doesn't necessarily work because you have to be a millionaire to actually own everything, but ignoring that, sort of being able to have everything shoved in is great. The problem is you don't really want to play through Lego games when you have a really small cast of characters. Like, every time they've tried to do it, it's not worked. Like, Indiana Jones is one of the worst ones. Pirates of the Caribbean is one of the worst ones. And then, like, it's worked really well with things like Harry Potter and Star Wars, who have huge expanded universes with lots and lots of characters. And The Incredibles just doesn't have that big cast that, say, Marvel and DC have. Like, at best, they're Lego Dimension characters. Like, I could see them working as a Lego Dimension pack. I'm not sure if they've killed off Lego Dimensions or something, but yeah, unless it was sort of like an all of Pixar pack, because you could do all of Disney as a good Lego game, but you really would then need to be able to go and play through the Little Mermaid level with Simba and things. Like, that's the sort of thing you'd want from your Lego Disney game, or with all of the various toys from Toy Story. I just don't think that The Incredibles has the cast to pull it off. And especially considering that Lego games are already struggling with their formula being too monotonous. Yeah. It is a pity. But oh well, these things happen. Talking of games for toy lovers, Nintendo's been announcing more of its Labo stuff, and been talking more about the so when you buy sort of the Labo kits, there's also a section by which you can make your own stuff, and they've been showing little bits and pieces of that. The second video that's come out, and really it's been talking about the IR reflectors and how you can, just using white and black, or even better, shiny surfaces, like aluminium tape, you can really map these things out and make your own Labo products. This just really excites me. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the maker community can do with all of these things. My small hope is that Labo does really well, and they instead of the sequel to Labo being more cardboard shit, I think more cardboard shit will inevitably come with it. But I think the thing that I'd really love to see is a new controller type. So the idea, in my opinion, would be so rather than having like one of the Joy-Cons, like instead you could pair up, so slot number 3, instead of a third Toy-Con, you end up with this sort of little motherboard with slots on it, and you could then plug in various bits and pieces into it, mostly things like motors or servos and things. I think that would be really great, because then you could literally make sort of your remote controlled robots and things, because you could put the servos and connect things to it, and they'd obviously sell some of the servos would be connected to it, and it would be proprietary Nintendo stuff, so people who wanted to make big robots would have to spend lots of money, but that's why I think Nintendo should do it. But I think that would just be really cool fun. I mean, I personally, I'm kind of excited for the Labo stuff. I don't quite have the money for it right now, but it's something I definitely am interested in. But moving forward, I think that there really is that sort of, if it really goes off with the maker community and they do what I just said, and I get the feeling that they're interested in doing that as well, because I think that the maker community is such a big part, becoming such a bigger part of life, and I think that Nintendo being able to sort of jump on their version of it's not really a Raspberry Pi, but sort of a Nintendo version of that, I think would be really smart from their perspective. And part of me really loves the idea of Cardboard Robot Wars, because you could totally make that. Like, you'd have a few motors, and you'd be able to go, okay, I've got a few motors and some servos. I mean, probably, the way that I'm thinking of it, like, your one controller would have sort of 4 inputs, so you'd probably have to make a decision between controlling all 4 wheels, or you'd have to lose a control of one of your wheels if you wanted a weapon. So if you wanted a flipper or a spinning thing, you'd have to change it up. The thing is that you could then have Robot Wars, because you could both make your stuff out of cardboard, and then you've sort of got the advantage that so long as people only use cardboard, you can have spinning discs hitting each other, and you could spin them enough that they might be able to damage other cardboard, but not have them spinning enough that they would actually damage people. And that's an important part, because if it damages people, you can't sell them. So being able to make, to be able to do that sort of Robot Wars thing with your cardboard wheels, and you sort of smash someone's wheels enough so that it gets bent and you're like, ah. But then if you make really thick wheels, it just moves so slowly and the other person can sort of bash you around. I think there's a real potential for that, and I hope that Nintendo does go down that path. And it seems like they've got a pretty involved system, like particularly this idea of being able to just cover and uncover things that are reflective, just means you can sort of turn so much into a controller suddenly. It's really, I'm really excited for it, and really excited to see what the community can do with it. Speaking of making things, I recently saw a video of a sort of fan project called Sonic Maker, which is exactly what it sounds like. You sort of have these curved tools, and you draw out a level, and then you can play the level, and you sort of put in springs and things, and you play it as Sonic. I mean, I'm mostly mentioning this because my best friend happens to be a giant Sonic the Hedgehog nerd and very fond of making his own levels. And on the off chance that he's listening to this, you should totally check this out. I don't think it's actually out yet. I think they're still working on it, but that's something you might want to pay attention to. You should probably pay attention to it, because it's probably going to exist and then not exist very quickly afterwards when the copyright strike comes against it. As these things do, like another Metroid 2 remake, which sort of was, I'm here, I'm gone. Like, if this is something that you're going to want, just be on the ball for it. What else do we have? Pixel Junk Monsters 2 is coming out. I don't really have much views on the game. It just seems like a pretty standard tower defense game. However, I did want to mention it because it just looks gorgeous. Like, it sort of has this handmade toy type feel to the art style. And like all of the art textures feel like they've been painted and not quite don't quite fit the lines. And it's almost got like this wooden type feel to a lot of things, or plasticine type feel to other things. It's a really cool art style, which if you're into those sorts of things, it's worth having a look at. And if you're a Pixel Junk fan, then it's worth having a look at for that as well. There was a new trailer for a game called The Adventure Pals, which looks a lot like, as the name sort of suggests, it's very much trying to be Adventure Time, and it seems like a pretty basic platformer, but with that sort of Adventure Time mentality to it. And I feel like this is one of those games which is either going to hit the nail on the head or try and be something and miss the magic. And I think, unfortunately, until it comes out, we will never know. Well, we will know when it comes out, but until then, we won't know. But if you are a platforming fan and a fan of Adventure Time, feel free to have a look at it and tell me whether or not it has the magic. I don't know. And then finally, possibly the biggest news of the week, Japan is making, or a Japanese company is making, a Joy-Con controller with a D-pad. It's a proper D-pad on a Switch. And that's what we all need, is proper D-pads on Switches. And we all now have one. The lack of a proper D-pad doesn't actually bug me that much, but I think that's because I'm not playing a lot of games right now which require the D-pad. And I totally understand why some people want one, and it seems like most companies are not actually making proper D-pads. They're just sort of putting in a D-pad which you can press all 4 buttons at the same time, and I think this is a proper D-pad in the controller, and not one of these sort of, you have to take apart your controller and switch it between two. This is someone who has got the permission from Nintendo to manufacture their own boards. So, yes, I'm really looking forward to that. So next I'd like to talk about a new mobile game called Chain Strike. Now, Chain Strike is sort of one of those really great games to review. Not because it's great and not because it's awful, but because it tries to do a lot of interesting things and it doesn't really succeed. Well, it kind of succeeds. Let's get into the review. So, yes, Chain Strike is at its core a Final Fantasy Tactics mixed with chess, mixed with a free-to-play bollocks. For the most part, I'm not judging it on the fact that it's got free-to-play bollocks, because that's how these games make money, and that's sort of fine, I suppose. But I do think it's going to come back later on, so it is worth noting. But even ignoring that, yeah, so story-wise, Chain Strike is pretty boring. Admittedly, it's all in, I want to say Korean. It's definitely not English, and that's the only language I speak. It's all of the text is in English, and they do say that they're going to have some audio packs for you to download to put English languages in. I kind of wish there was an option to turn the Korean voices off, because I can't read already, so that I regularly miss bits. And then on top of that, I've got to filter out all of these voices that make no sense to me. So there are some fixes. Like I said, there is an option to download voice packs, which they say will be available later, so that's not the biggest problem. The story's fairly basic quest stuff. I mean, the real interesting twist they have is that a person has come back from the future to sort of save the world this time, which is exactly the same plot as the turn-based strategy. It's not Into the Void, is it? I think it's Into the Void, but I'm now double-checking Steam to make sure. But, Into the Breach, that was it. Yes, so it's kind of funny that we've got the same story coming out at both at the same time, and there are some similarities, and the way that they both approach things is actually interesting in their differences. So going back to Chain Strike. So Chain Strike, when I say it's like chess, I do actually mean they're trying to make all of the pieces like chess pieces. It's played on a grid, and but it's a smaller board. I think it's like 5 by 8 or something rather than 8 by 8. So it's a much smaller board. And yeah, all of the pieces have 5 classes, and the 5 classes are the 5 classes of, well, 5 of the 6 chess pieces. So you have a king, a queen, a rook, a bishop, and a knight. And that's sort of an interesting approach to things. I think they've made some big changes, and I sort of understand why they made these changes, but I also think a lot of them made sometimes there's a problem where when you fix a problem and you create a new one, and if you create enough of those, you might end up going, hey, I fixed everything, but it turns out you actually broke the core of what made a thing work. In this case, in chess, when you move a piece, you move it and you take a piece. And in this game, because they want to have leveling in it to make it more of a JRPG, you actually have to do damage to people rather than take them, which means that positionally, and you only move into the place that you took after you've actually taken them, but it means that things like sacrificing pieces and that sort of, I don't want to go there because they'll take me, because it's, if I go there they'll deal me some damage, it's not that same sort of urgency and immediate response. Also, the temptation when you've got your pieces in a good formation is just to keep standing still. I'll come back to why it's important to have a formation. But yeah, they sort of have this problem where because you're doing damage rather than taking a piece, you certainly lose an amount of the flow of chess. I think the other problem that they had, and again, this is coming from their business model, which is that because they want to sell you characters, and they want you to level up your characters, in fact, every character you can unlock in each of the 5 classes, and they have minor variations in abilities depending on which class they have. And it's... So the thing is, although all of their classes are named after chess pieces, only... Well, actually, none of them actually move like a chess piece. The closest is the rook. The rook can move about 4 spaces up and down or left or right. And that's pretty close, bearing in mind that 5 gets you across the board. It means they can pretty much do what a rook can do. The problem starts coming, and is most evident when you then move to the bishop. You see, because they want you to be able to put together your team of any pieces you want, rather than a chess game where you have 2 bishops, bishops have a problem, which is a bishop can only move on the colour of square that it starts on. And that would be rubbish in a game where you could put as many pieces down as you want, because if you only have 1 bishop, he can only ever access half of the board, which is awful when you consider the rook can access every space on the board. So they couldn't let the bishop just have 4 spaces in a diagonal. So instead what they did was go 3 spaces in each diagonal, and then 1 space forward, 1 space back, 1 space to each side. And that probably could have worked. And then they had the king. And suddenly the king, who can only move the 4 spaces around, suddenly becomes really rubbish, because killing the king is no longer the thing that wins you the game, because you can have a team of 5 kings or no kings. So it doesn't need to have that unbalanced. I think that's the big thing. Like, in chess, not all pieces are equal. The queen is massively overpowered. At some point, I will do a review of chess by itself. But basically, yeah, chess is not a balanced game, but it is balanced from both sides because they have the same pieces. Now, because in this game, the imbalance comes from you having different pieces, because they weren't forcing you to always have 1 king, which I think possibly is a way that they could have fixed this, but they kind of wanted things to be a bit smaller, and I understand that, particularly for mobile games, you want things to be shorter. So yeah, so the king now, rather than just being able to move in his sort of the 8 squares around him, because basically the bishop can do that and can do some diagonal stuff, the king can now move basically like a rook, only he's slightly shorter in how far he can go and has sort of 1 space in the diagonals. And then the queen, which is of course the most overpowered piece in the game of chess, has been massively cut in that the queen can only go 2 spaces in any direction. So the queen has basically become a bit of a shotgun. Very useful when it's close to something, but absolutely rubbish at a distance. And the final piece is the knight. I think I'll come back to the knight, but I think just from listening to how much they've changed the movement options of the pieces, the 4 pieces that I've been talking about, you can sort of see how it no longer has that dynamic movement that chess has. It's not very much a sort of... It doesn't have that sort of I move a piece, you move a piece, I move a piece, because it's very hard to sort of go, well, how is that piece going to move? Because it's not like oh, it can only move diagonal, so it can only move there, there, and there. It's like, oh no, it can move all the way around. It's really hard to trap a piece, okay? And I think that's one of the fun things in chess. I think the two things I enjoy most is trapping a piece where you're like, I can't move that piece. I mean, I can move it, but as soon as I move it, it gets taken. And the other one is like that sort of, you can take this piece, it's just there tempting, but if you take it, I'll take your piece, and the piece that you're going to, it's the, I'll do the exchange, but you're going to end up at the worst of that deal, so you won't take it. And I love those sort of, that for me is where chess really comes alive, and this game doesn't have any of that. Because it's really hard to nail down where the characters are moving because they have these wider movesets. And like I said, I understand why they came to these decisions. It's not like I'm saying, oh, they tried to mess with chess and they ruined it. I mean, I understand where these came from. It was a balancing issue for the way that they worked. There is a solution, which is they could easily say you always have to use 5 pieces and you only get one of each type of piece. The problem then would be when you draw random cards, you would seriously be hindered if you drew nothing but rooks, because you'd then go, oh no, I can choose from one of 50 rooks, but I can't choose the rest of them, which is probably why they didn't go down that route. But I think that's a case of the game suffering because of the monetization method. And yeah, the monetization method is... no, you know what? I said I was going to talk about the knight. I will come back to the monetization method. So, the knight is an interesting one in this game. I actually really like what they did with it. They basically turned it into an artillery unit. He basically can attack around... Well, nothing that's adjacent to him, but then the space that's next to a space that's next to him, he can attack. Which actually makes a lot more sense than a knight. A knight's a very confusing piece to use, especially for newcomers. However, in this game, it's also weird because he's the only piece who can jump over things, and because everyone else can just sort of move around and bump into things, and you normally go through and you actually forget that the game's supposed to be based on chess. It actually took me a while to realise that people block other people's paths, but because so many people have so many sort of, I can move like a king with a few extra moves, a traditional king with a few extra moves, it's just impossible to actually sort of feel like chess because everyone can move around fairly normally, which is a pity. And so, yeah, I do actually like the idea of turning the knight into basically an artillery unit. I think that was a smart move, and one of the few times I really felt like they actually made an improvement on the system. I think that was one of the few times where I went, you know what, that really did a good job of putting it into being able to take another tactical job that we're very used to in these games, and the fact that it is a little bit simpler to work out where these things are. But the other thing is, like, they attack along these paths, but they also move along these paths, which does mean that the knight is just as awkward to maneuver into the right place as ever, which is wonderful. Really useful because he can attack a lot of units, so sometimes really useful, but also a right pain to get into the right place at the right time. And so the reason that's useful, so I know I've pretty much hated on this game so far, and there are actually quite a few good things in this game. The first thing I liked is the way that it decided to break down what you can do in a chess turn. Essentially, they give you 3 3 action points, and pretty much every attack takes 2 action points, and pretty much most support abilities cost 1 movement. Sorry, 1 action point, and movement. You can see where my slip up was there. Movement costs 1 action point. So it means that for the most part you move a piece and you can attack with a piece, and you can't, unlike chess where the piece that you move you have to attack with, the opposite's true with this. Like, once you've moved a piece you can't then attack with it. So it's a little bit, but I liked that sort of breakdown of, we want you to be able to move and attack, but we want to limit what you can do. And I actually really liked the 2 and 3, and then when things get really bad you can go, okay, everyone just moves. That doesn't always work, but sometimes that's a helpful thing to do. You also have some abilities which are cost 0 and are sort of just perk abilities, because it's a sort of game where you have lots of special abilities, because that's sort of the Final Fantasy Tactics part of it. And yeah, I actually think that works well. I'm not sure it works perfectly for this game, but in general I approve of the concept and the allocation of points. And the thing that I think that what makes this game the most interesting and the most fun has nothing to do with any of its inspiration material. I'll admit I'm a little bit biased because this is a kind of mechanic that I constantly want to make a game of, and maybe one day I will, but it's not very high on many of my lists, mostly because the game that makes most sense for me to use this mechanic with is this sort of game, and this sort of game is one where you've got lots of characters and you're like, hey, let's have a game with lots of characters, and that's not very easy for an independent studio to make, and big studios who do make those games often want more financial grinding systems in there than I'm happy with. But yeah, so the mechanic, I didn't mention it. So it has a system by which the pieces all combo with each other. So if you could attack a unit with multiple pieces, this is where the name of the game comes from, Chain Strike. When you actually attack that piece, you initiate a chain strike in which everyone who could attack gets to attack first, and then you perform the attack that you actually applied. It's not entirely clear what abilities you have apply to your chain attack. You do have 2 attack values. You have a normal attack value and a chain attack value, so some characters are better at initiating attacks but aren't very good for chaining, and some characters you sort of want to cover them but not actually be the aggressor. This makes for a really interesting system, and particularly because even once you've moved a piece, you can't attack with that piece, but it can still be used in a chain strike. So there is that sort of, and the chain strike's significant. I think that's the other important thing. Like, the chain strike is often something in the range of like 2/3 of an actual attack, so having an extra person attack, having a chain strike means that, you know, you've got an extra 2/3 to your attack, and especially if you can get 3 or even 4, you're suddenly going, oh look, I did 3 turns of damage all in one go, and that's very nice. And it does encourage you to think sort of, how many places am I covering? And this again is where that sort of, that artillery unit's really useful when you're hitting things, and really useful to have those units for chain striking. You just generally don't actually want to use them a lot once you've put them down somewhere. So yeah, I really like that system. I think the nature of perks, area of effects, has so much potential, particularly in this type of game where you're collecting multiple characters and leveling them up and things. I've yet to decide what I will and won't cover in these podcasts. But I think this idea I'm happy to put out because I don't think there is enough of it that if anyone was to copy it, I wouldn't go, oh, that was definitely my idea. So I think my idea, if I was to do it, would be a game where you had a home base on a grid type structure, and your home base would cover a small amount of power slots. And the power slots would be spaces adjacent to your base. And then you'd be able to play down units, and some of your units would be power extenders, and you'd sit them down on a power unit, on a powered space, probably from your base for early on, but then they would make new powered spaces, only their reach would go further. And then the idea would be that you, unlike this game where it's like you get the more attacks from doing things, in this case, I would basically let your stats change depending on the space that you're on. So you want to be on a space that's hit by multiple power grids, because if two power grids both cover the same space, then that has a double power, and that means that when you put a unit on it, he unlocks level 2 abilities, as opposed to his level 0 or level 1 abilities. His level 0 is probably just basic movement, and level 2 and 3 are going to be sort of, 1 to 3 are going to be sort of much more impressive things. And possibly, like, you'd end up with a defense of a value of these characters, and their defense would be you can only take it, or you can only kill it in one go, so that it would be you need to get a unit with 3 power to be able to take these pieces. And so for me, it would be that sort of, you're kind of slowly base building, but then at the same time, you're trying to go through and disrupt your opponent's network, and that's sort of where the game would be. You'd have to test it an awful lot to work out how it all works, and like I said, I think for it to work, you need to have that sort of different characters have different special abilities, and you'd want to have a wide variety of characters, and that's just something that as a one-man studio I certainly can't do, and I probably couldn't do even if I became sort of a 5-man studio, or a 5-person studio, sorry. And I feel like, yeah, you'd have to care more about monetization and people leveling up, and I'd want all of the core stats to really be affected by the power levels, and remove some of the basic monetization systems. And going back to talking about Chain Strike now, rather than my flights of fancy, Chain Strike's pretty guilty when it comes to microtransactions. You open up the store and it's like, hey, buy this special offer for £100, and I'm like, that's not the sort of money that I spend on a game, unless it's sort of a collector's edition with absolutely everything shoved in it. I feel like games don't do microtransactions right, but on top of that, like, this game really has a thick layer of all of the worst of those things. It's not terrible in its giving out of free things. As far as I can tell, it gives you a 1 to 3 star character fairly on sort of multiple times a day, and then about once a day it gives you a summon for 3 to 5 stars, and 5 stars is currently the maximum number of stars. So it's not necessarily an egregious sort of it's not one of these games where it's like, you can't play this unless you put money into it. You probably can. The thing is it's the way that you level up your character. That none of this is new mechanics, and none of this is particularly them, but it is the sort of, you have to level up a character, and you get bonuses, and your skills level up when you sort of kill off another one of those characters, which means you actually want to draw multiples of this character, because having one isn't good enough. You need to have 3 to sacrifice for this one to actually have its full stats. Which goes even worse when it's sort of like, okay, considering this is a brand new game, it already has, okay, this is how you evolve it, this is how you transcend it, and then this is how you unlock runes. And each one of... You don't need another copy of that card to evolve it, but it does help. And then you do need another copy of the card to transcend it and whatever else it is. And that, like that last one where it's unlock relics, you need to find another 2 copies of that card and get them to transcended level to unlock them, which is hella work. Way more work than anyone should ever want to put into a game. Even me, who likes grinding level games, that's too much. And on top of that, it's sort of oh yeah, and then on top of that, you've got the added problem that each of these characters that you have 5 versions, and for the most part, there are a lot of similarities between them. They obviously all use the same character model, and 2 of their 4 abilities are always the same, and then they generally have 2 extra abilities, and each one is it's one or the other, so they're sort of 2 variations, and so you have to work out which ones have the right mix of those abilities. But then part of the collection reward is the more of those 5 that you've got, you need a complete set if you want your character to have the best stats. And it's all just it's just a lot. It's just an awful lot. Like, you know, if you want to have all of your options, it's a huge commitment. It's already got an awful lot of characters, and I know that's how this game system works. Like, it's probably not the worst, but it's pretty bad on its sort of monetization method, and like I said, I think that some of that has affected the game. Like, I feel like if they could control the way that they were revealing things better, you could have got the movement system and narrowed down how it was working. But on the other hand, that's how they're making money, and yeah, I think if it wasn't quite so offensive, I would possibly... sorry, on the monetization front, not in general. I think the chances of me playing this that I'd play this for a lot longer if I didn't have to evolve and transcend and get 5 copies of everything. If I just had to level it up and get the evolution stones for standard evolutions, I think I would be more inclined to keep playing. Also, it has the sort of autoplay function, which I will mention because it has one of the weirder versions I've seen of this, in that it will go through and you can basically say, I want you to autoplay the game, and then it just autoplays the game in front of you, which I know isn't wrong, but like, the fact that you can do it at any time, A, makes you playing the game feel pointless, and B, like, the other big part of it is I feel like there's the I can't remember which mobile games I've played and which systems going into which, but in general, the idea of the autoplay, the general concept is there because, particularly because they limit how many times you can play things when you want to grind things. It's basically saying the cost to grinding is lightning bolts normally. I think in this is shoes, pairs of boots, and it's sort of here is a currency that we are limiting, and rather than you replaying the same level over and over again, when you've got a full bar of energy and you've only got time for one game, you can spend the rest of your energy on sort of replaying an old game so you can get a little bit of experience points, a little bit of money, and maybe some rewards, normally equipment from a level that is slightly below you, which you can then destroy and craft into something new or whatever. And I don't have a problem with that. Like, that makes sense. But normally for me, like, what you do is you press the autoplay button and then it just goes, yeah, you probably got this result. I think it's worked best for me when it's the... in fact, the time I remember it working best, I don't remember the game, but I do remember that you basically needed the top rank, the S rank, and you could only replay levels that you got the S rank on. And I actually did a pretty good job on that game of going back and replaying games to get the S rank, because only once I'd got the S rank could I grind for the boots in that area or the sword in that area. I think that's a smart way to do it. But then when you do that, you just get the options screen and you go autoplay, and it goes cool. And then it just gives you the conclusion screen at the end, and you don't actually go into the game. With this game, it literally starts moving through. Everyone takes their turn all the way through. You can stop it at any point. And I'm like, I feel like this is kind of missing the point. So yeah, so that's Chain Strike. It's interesting looking at how this game worked, and particularly Into the Breach, which, as Dan will tell you, my friend Dan from Nerdhued, is from the same people who made Faster Than Light. And they very much, that is a game where movement feels important, because when you move a piece, you can bash things, and so even if you're not killing a piece in one move like in chess, because you can make a move and affect what they could do, I feel like that has that sort of charge and bash and that sort of movement really gave that game a better feeling of moving forward and attacking things. That said, Into the Breach, I have played through that game with every team, and I still don't know what the actual movement structure of most of those enemies are. I know their attacking patterns, but I never got to a point where I was planning more than one move ahead. Again, I still didn't have that you were trapping something. I think that game worked really well. I will probably do a full review of it at some point, maybe later. But yeah, I think that they sort of successfully did that. I've got to move here, and that idea that a hit means something, even if the hit doesn't kill it immediately. But on the other hand, like, that was a game where you didn't really level up. Like, you got small leveling up over time as opposed to sort of a persistent leveling up. And they only did 5 turns as opposed to the mobile game where they sort of wanted it to last longer. Though I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing, particularly considering it's a mobile game. Um, whereas Into the Breach was for a PC and yet still did very fast fights. But yeah, the Chain Strike normally has sort of a goal of sort of 11 moves and allows you 20, or on the early levels anyway. Yeah, I think there's some interesting stuff here, and I think if you're the sort of person who finds tactical games interesting, this might be something that you can find fun. I don't think they entirely hit what they wanted to, and it seems a little bit weird when you've got these little pieces stacking around where they're like, this is a bishop, or this is a queen, and you're like, it's nothing like a queen. Queens can move from one side of the board to the other. This really feels more like the king than the king does, because the king feels like the rook plus. And it's like, yeah, there are some concepts in there that perhaps if they hadn't quite so heavy said, these are all based on chess pieces, perhaps I wouldn't have come in going, well, this didn't quite work, this didn't quite work. Yeah, I feel like there's potential with this game, and maybe it is something that you like. But I think I for one, am interested in seeing what's next. I don't think this is the perfect version of this game. Like I said, I do love combining abilities and that idea of you position things slowly and then those things sort of have knock-on effects to other things, particularly with this format, the idea of this unit can affect this pattern. I think that's really an interesting concept, and I think this game has so far done the best job of that, because you do have that sort of positioning. It reminds me very much of a game that Square Enix made where you got these sort of huge bonuses every time that was a game where it was just grid and no 3D models at all. Chain Strike has a very nice set of 3D models. I can't remember what this Square Enix game was called, but they were literally just pictures. And the idea was, on its face, it looked sort of like a game of chess sort of thing, where you were moving pieces and you got bonuses for things sort of being in rows with each other. However, it actually ended up being a dexterity game, because you were only allowed to move one piece, but you could move that piece anywhere you wanted so long as it didn't hit enemy pieces. And then you had a time limit. You had a 3-second time limit, but you could basically move pieces ally pieces by moving into them, which means you'd end up doing this sort of random circles trying to rapidly move another piece into the right space until you got there, which turned this sort of really tactical game into this sort of mad, frantic skill mini game. I think I actually ended up playing that one for quite some time. I actually quite liked that one. I can't remember what its name is. I'll edit that in just a second. Okay, I'm back. So the weird Square Enix game, for those of you that were interested, was called Terra Battle. Like I said, it's one of those weird games in that it's both very tactical and very dexterity based, but in a way that's the total opposite of the way that you'd want those two things, in that it's tactical, but if you're not very good at the dexterity part, your tactics are worth shit, and if you're very successful at the dexterity game but you have no tactics, the game is rubbish. You have to be good at both of those things for it to work. But if you're interested in looking at weird mechanics and thinking about how they could be used in other places, it's worth a look. Like I said, I think Chain Strike did a better job of getting the combo moving right, and I am going to stop the review there before I go on too much longer. Next, I'd like to talk to you about an investment opportunity. Um, so, it's not me. I'm not saying invest in me. I mean, if the podcast goes well, when I do set up the Patreon, then perhaps that will be the case. But no, what I'm really interested in right now is, for the first time in my life, and I'll admit, I'm not the most technical, not the most financially smart person. So it's very rare for me to spot something and go, you know what, you could make a fair amount of money buying and selling that product. And I think for the first time in my life, I've actually spotted one. And the product is, it's a board game, because of course it is. That's sort of my area of expertise these days. And the game itself is Batman Gotham City Chronicles. It's a game that's on Kickstarter right now. By the time this podcast gets released, it will be very close to ending. It is a Kickstarter exclusive, and which means it's only going to be made during Kickstarter, which might sound weird, but it's one of those ones where to keep costs down, a lot of companies these days are now saying that they're only going to make these games for Kickstarter, where they know how many copies they have, and because it's cheaper to sell straight to people than it is to sell to shops. In fact, I think it probably really started with Riot Games Mechs vs Minions, where they sort of did we are going to give you a really high quality product, but we can only deliver this high quality product by selling straight to you, so you have to go through their website if you want to get a copy of that game. Which you should, it's a very good game. I'll probably come back to that at some point. But anyway, so why do I think Batman Gotham City Chronicles is an investment? So the idea of an investment is often that you spend some money and it can make money later on. Now, a lot of times I think when people say, oh, this is an investment, I think a lot of people, sort of like people who invest in comics and things, there's this kind of fallacy that this will become worth a lot of money, and then you realise that lots of people are buying it because they think it's worth a lot of money, and then it's not worth a lot of money. Fortunately, I don't think many people are going, oh, this Batman board game on Kickstarter, that's an investment opportunity. So I think that sort of first problem has been solved. The second question, and this is one of the big ones, is, are people still going to want it in the future, right? Owning the only copy of something makes it really valuable if lots of people want it. But owning the only copy of Elvis's shit that he did on the toilet, oh no, that would actually probably be worth money. Ah, that's awful. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. If you have something like, this is the only pebble that that my dad gave to my mum on their first date because of an inside joke, like, other than your parents and your immediate family, no one cares about that. So even though it's really rare, it's not something that anyone outside of a very small number of people would care about. Therefore, no one's going to care. The thing about Batman is an awful lot of people like Batman. And I've looked at this game and I think it's a good game. I think I'll come back to that later on, but at the moment, yeah, it looks like it's a good game. And I think the fact that it is such a good game And I think the fact that Batman is so popular means that this is absolutely going to become a game that people talk about being a really big deal. Now, equally, that doesn't necessarily mean that something's valuable. Monopoly, despite the fact it being a truly awful game, sells loads of copies, and having really old versions of Monopoly are not really that valuable because they're constantly making new copies of Monopoly. If you want a copy of Monopoly, you just buy a copy of Monopoly. It therefore hasn't increased in value. It's no so the next question is, do I think they're just going to have extra printings of this? And I think the answer is probably not. Firstly, like I said, it's currently Kickstarter exclusive, so they might possibly get a second printing, but there's a high chance that it won't happen. And a lot of the most expensive board games out there are these games where someone had a good game based on a franchise, and the board game and the franchise are owned by two different people. I think one of the most one of the ones that I know best is a game called Queen's Gambit, which is a game where you play the final scene of Star Wars Episode 1. It has a full 3D board where you have to take over the throne room, while you also have a space battle and Darth Maul fighting the Jedi, and you have to you have to win 2 out of the 3 fights. So it's sort of this big, wonderful game. No one bought it because at the time, most time stuff was bad. Number 2, most Star Wars stuff was pretty bad connected to Episode 1. And number 3 was no one wanted to recreate the finale of Episode 1. However, since people now know it's a good game, it's a game that in hindsight people really want. And they can't reprint it because the people who own the copyrights to the game can't make new copies of it because they don't own the Star Wars license. And Star Wars can't remake the game because even if they did, because they don't have the license to the game, the mechanics, so they can only make something that's sort of similar, but they can't make the exact thing. There have sort of been fixes to this a little bit. There was a really good game, or so I hear. Both of these, I haven't played either of these because they're both really expensive games to get your hands on. But there was a game based on the Dune books that then got remade and set in a original universe in the Twilight Imperium series called Rex. So that game kind of got saved, but the fact that you can't have the game in its Dune format because they didn't have the copyright means that original copy is very expensive. Though I believe you can get a print and play version of it fairly easily. But that's the point, yes. The question is sort of, is it going to be easy to get hold of in the future? I don't think it is. I think this is one of those things that at most is going to get a second printing if it does really well. And I think chances are this will be a one-time offer. And that's also the next big one, because the other thing about judging an investment is you often end up with a problem where... So when something goes up for auction, for example, you can get a real bargain if you're the person at the auction and you're the only person at the auction that cares. However, if you're at an auction where all of the people who most care about a thing are there, then whoever buys it bought it for the exact amount of money it's worth. In fact, not only that, because they bought it, the thing itself is not worth that amount of money. Because if you were the person who bought something and you then needed to sell it, we know that no one else will pay the same amount of money for that you did, otherwise they would have won the auction. So you'd have to sell it to whoever was the second highest bidder at the second lowest value. The thing only increases in value if new people want to purchase that thing that didn't have it before. And that's sort of, so you end up with this problem with a lot of these things where it's like, oh look, I bought a thing, and it's like, yes, but that just means that you own it, and we're talking about investing rather than owning something. And so the next question becomes, can you make it into something... is there going to be an audience out there who didn't get to go in and buy it at the same price at the same price that you're buying it? Because if they buy it at the same price you're buying it, then you've got no one to sell to. I think we are going to have new Batman fans, and I think Batman fans will find money and become more wealthy. There are certainly students who probably can't afford this game right now, who in 10 years' time will have enough funds to be able to buy this game, but at a markup. So I do believe that the Batman fans will exist. Also, of all Batman fans out there, I don't think all of them know about this Kickstarter, and I don't think all of them necessarily have the funds now. There is a case to be made for, if you can buy something now and sell it later on, a new set of people who missed the first opportunity might now have more funds, the funds enough to rectify their mistake. So I think the audience is there. Really, the big question is... So really, this should be a surefire bet. The only two things that I think are really questionable is, one is my original preposition, which is I think this is a good game, and it's going to be a game that people will keep talking about in the future and be like, oh, did you ever hear about that really good Batman game? And I think that's sort of... and the other one is, do they do a second printing? And there's no way of me knowing that they're not going to make a second printing. It's just my gut that says they won't. And I suppose that's a gamble that you're making if you are looking at this as an investment. But as far as gambles go, that's one of the safer ones. So the big question is this game any good? So the game itself is it's a dungeon crawling game. It currently has a few... Its core mode is a type of dungeon crawler called One versus Many, which is sort of... It's a variation on the role-playing game, where there's one person who plays the dungeon master and everyone else gets to play the heroes. I don't like this as a board game in general. I think if you're role-playing, it's fine, or in fact it works very well, because I think that as a player character in a role-playing game, you get to drive the story forward, and I feel like as the owner of the world and the GM, or the dungeon master, or whatever you call him, you really get to craft the experience. You have a lot of creative control on what's going on, and I think there's a really good part of... There's no way you can say, we told that story and the GM wasn't a huge part of it. So there's a lot of creativity that goes into that role, and I think that, if anything, sometimes that can be the more interesting part to play. So I definitely think that works in those situations where playing the world is really useful. The problem when it comes to board games is when you run this as a board game, I don't know, I personally always have trouble as a GM, it's not really your job to. It's your job to challenge your opponents, but it's not really your job to try and kill them all off in one go. Like, no one really wants that. If you can kill off one of them, then maybe that's interesting, but if you totally wiped the entire party, no one's going to want to play with you as the GM again. Unless you've got a very particular type of players, or you're playing a particular type of game, like a one-shot or something, or a horror game. But, like, in general, that's not what you want to do. And so you don't play the game to win as the GM, you play the game to tell a story. But when you're actually playing a game, a proper board game, then what actually happens is that if you play the bad guys, A, you generally can do significantly less interesting stuff, and B, if you win, 4 people lose, and if they win, only you lose. And there's kind of a bit of a utilitarian part of me where it's like, the greatest good for the greatest people means I should lose this game. And I know that's not fun, and I know that's not how it's supposed. Anyway, that's why I don't do very well on these games normally, because playing as a horde of orcs is less fun against sort of a small group of adventurers. Just doesn't excite me particularly. If you are inclined to do that, I'd say go for like the wargaming, where you can have an entire army, but they have an entire army too. Like, I think there are good places for if that's what you want, but yeah, I'm not a big fan of the idea of, hey, I get to play as the stormtroopers, and you get to go through with your lightsaber characters who level up and sort of have character arcs, and I just keep throwing stormtroopers at you. Oh, look, this time he's got a slightly different weapon. Ooh, it doesn't work for me. It's not my game. And that is the core of this game. And I think the big reason why I don't mind it here is because Batman has really good villains. Oh, he just does. Like, normally it's like, okay, so I sort of mentioned Star Wars. Like, okay, so I would definitely wouldn't mind playing as Darth Vader. Maybe Darth Maul? Maybe General Grievous? But only if he was like a side character. I wouldn't want him as the main character. Like, I start running out. Boba Fett, I suppose, is pretty cool, but I run out pretty quickly of characters that I find really interesting in the dark side, especially considering how useless stormtroopers are in canon. And yeah, so I want to play the Jedis and the smugglers and, the more interesting, the bounty hunters. And Batman is one of the few cases where, although playing as a group of Joker thugs doesn't interest me, the fact that in general you're given 2 characters, or two lead villains, and they've done a pretty good job of personalizing all of the villains so that they feel like the villains you're expecting. So Bane has an extra state where you can pump him full of venom, where he becomes less intelligent and more aggressive, or there are multiple versions of the Joker, so depending on which version of the Joker you want, there's Clayface, who can sort of go through and smash through things and shapeshift. I shouldn't say that, I don't actually know that one for sure. I'm assuming he can. Two-Face has 2 versions of him for each side of the coin. Poison ivy can use plants and things. Scarecrow has fear toxin. Um, Riddler's very smart. Like, all of the characters have big depth to them in the way that you'd expect them to, and play differently and have their own special features, and a lot of them have their own cards as well. And so it's and they've like the characters I listed there, I think are all characters just in the core box. And bearing in mind that the game has gone through enough expansions now that they've gone through nearly every Batman character. Like, they're bringing out loads of characters where I'm like, I have no idea who the hell that is, and have to look them up on the wiki. And they've started taking a few of the Green Arrow characters to go on the hero side as well. Like the Green Arrow and Black Canary. Which I suppose, considering that the Arrow TV show keeps stealing Batman villains, is fair enough. But yeah, the point is I don't mind playing the bad guys in this game, because there's an awful lot of cool bad guys. On top of that, they do have an expansion for playing, I suppose, Suicide Squad, or playing from the perspective of the supervillains, against where the person who plays the many, the person who plays the one instead plays police cops and Batman and things. Or the other one is that you can both play 1 versus 1, and you have a collection. So the Batman player gets to play as Batman, Robin, and he's only allowed 2 characters, and then has sort of police officers and things as his extra things, and then the other guy has 2 characters and then a collection of thugs and things. Overall, the general mechanics, there's a lot of dice rolling with custom dice, but the main mechanic is you sort of have a small amount of energy, and you can spend your energy on various actions. And how many actions you can spend is dependent on your character, and depending on how good at an action your character is depends on what they can, what dice they roll. So if you put lots of energy into... So I think Catwoman, for example, has more re-rolls because she is lucky, but sort of has worse dice for close combat than, say, Batman in an armoured suit, which has pretty strong close combat abilities. But that having been said, they have other things that sort of change around them. The general idea, though, is that you have this energy, it sort of slowly regenerates every turn, or if you take a rest action, you regenerate a lot of energy, and then you're using this energy and having to decide when to use it. And there's also the decision of how many times do you want to hit versus... so, like with close combat, you can use 3 cubes to roll 1 dice, see if you hit, roll another dice, see if you hit, roll another dice, see if you hit. Or you can just roll all 3 together and try and get 1 big hit, which might be overkill and, really drain your resources. On the other hand, that might be what you want. You can spend dice to re-roll. They've done a nice thing where there's an awful lot of special abilities, but an awful lot of the special abilities are weight-based, so as you can pick up gear as you go through, you sort of gain abilities. Often, like weapons, will give you extra dice, which might be a reason for you to just roll 1 dice, because it might be... let's say you spend an energy and you get a yellow dice, and you've got a weapon that gives you a red dice to your attacks. If you put all three in the same time, you roll 3 yellow and a red. Whereas if you do it one at a time, you roll a yellow and a red, a yellow and a red, and a yellow and a red, which might do more damage. It depends really on the defense of the character that you're attacking. But there are lots of abilities, sort of, counterattacks and free hits if you hit them once, and things like this. But a lot of them are weight-based, so you sort of lose some of your abilities the more you actually end up picking up along the way. So there is sort of a balance there of how much can you be over-equipped. The only exception to that is that you do get bat gadgets with a Batman belt if you're playing on the good guy's side. And how many bat gadgets you get is very dependent on how close to Batman you are. And there are, again, like I said, there are multiple Jokers, there are multiple versions of Batman, so there are some versions of Batman which have different stats and things. There's a very nice model of the Batmobile included, but not in the main game, that's in the expansions. The game in general is a little bit pricey, but I don't think it's unreasonably pricey. We're talking about roughly in the range of £250. I don't have the numbers up right now. I'd say that's about average for this sort of game. Like right now, there's also a Kickstarter running for a Pacific Rim game, and if you want everything in the Pacific Rim game, that will also cost you £250. And that £250 was for everything in the Batman game. I think you can get it for about £150 if you don't want the expansions. But I think you probably do want the expansions, even though they're definitely less good value than, because of the way that Kickstarters work, it's like, this is what's in the main box, and then all of the expansions just get all of the stretch goals have been thrown in the main box, which means the main box is actually very good value for money, but the expansions, which haven't actually been improved upon, have become significantly less value. But if you treat the whole thing as a combined thing, it's not too bad. Or it's not too bad given the market. Like I said, there's a Pacific Rim game which doesn't look as interesting to me. It's using fairly standard skirmish attacks rather than the way that the Batman game is used, where you're sort of making decisions of allocating energy before you roll dice, and the amount of extra special moves means that there's very much role-playing game type feel to it, except with a board with very clear line of sights and things added. And it actually has a really nice how do you work out line of sight, so that elevated people, you can know whether or not an elevated thing can notice by sort of, there's a key to it, so it's sort of like slot A can see other things with slot A on them. Sorry, that was for the Batman game. So for Pacific Rim, it's a little bit more standard. You've got a collection of kaiju and a collection of giant robots, and they sort of run at each other. I don't think it looks like a bad game, it just doesn't look like anything new or interesting that I haven't seen before. It looks like fairly standard mechanics. And its big selling point is that it has these Pacific Rim characters, but I don't think that many people care about Pacific Rim, especially not compared to Batman. Assuming that both of these are very successful, both of them have been doing very well, but like, assuming they both hit their maximum, whatever it is they can financially afford to shove in with stretch goals, Batman's going to have a huge, way more figures. Admittedly, Batman's figures are slightly smaller, however, the Pacific Rim ones are pre-painted, whereas the Batman ones are all in basic plastic colour or a coloured plastic colour. So that's something to bear in mind, but at the same time, it's so yeah. I think there's a good chance, because I mean, there's only a small number of kaiju in the two films, and there's only a small number of hero systems of hero mechs in the two films. So they're actually quite limited as to what can be included, whereas the Batman franchise is huge, and the number of characters they keep adding, because there isn't a Robin, like it's, they're including multiple Robins for all of the various different people who has played Robin, as well as Red Hood and Nightwing, and so you can play them as older or younger. So yeah, it covers a lot, and I think that's a really good a good part of it. Sorry, I was just comparing value, because I understand people who go £250 for a board game, but that is kind of what these sort of miniature games do cost, and particularly because it is going to be a huge amount of miniatures, and miniatures also cost a lot of money to sort of get sculpted and things. And then it's roughly the same price as there's Harry Potter also has a miniatures game out right now, and they also have a £250 option, which I think has about, I mean, I was going to say they have about roughly the same number of models, but now I'm actually looking at it, and I think the Batman one probably has way more than the Harry Potter game. For those of you who are like, Harry Potter miniature game, yeah, there's a Harry Potter miniature game by Night Models. It doesn't look good. I mean, there aren't very many clear. They're basically trying to run a Kickstarter, but not actually running the Kickstarter. But they're sort of, it was umming and erring on it. So even this sort of all-in thing, it's sort of we know there aren't any stretch goals, but they're only accepting pre-orders now. So if you're a Harry Potter fan and you like miniatures, then I don't think this is I think this is a perfectly fine purchase if you like those things. Unfortunately, I should also mention the Harry Potter one is exclusively for Spain and England. No, they don't have the license to sell it anywhere else. So, if you are a fan of painting miniatures, Harry Potter, and you live in England and France, Britain and France, then this might well be something you want to invest in. I have way too many unpainted miniatures for me to go, oh yes, I need to have that. And then on top of that, I just don't think it's a very good game, and I do care about how good a game things are. And in this particular case, it's a skirmish game. They've basically taken normal fighting mechanics that you'd expect to see in a game. I'm trying to think of a good example. Like, you could use these mechanics and say, oh, it's a James Bond game, and it would work just as well, because it's like, I mean, you'd have to tweak bits of it because they acquire magic, and you'd have to do like, I acquire magic points or focus points and I spend them on using my weapons. But it's basically you set up a board, you put down terrain, you move around and you fire spells at each other. And I'm like, that's not what Harry Potter's about. And that's sort of why the Batman one works really well, because the one versus many, the sort of idea of there are two Batman characters. There's an awful lot of scenarios they're packing in there. Sorry, two Batman villains, and a small group of Batman heroes have got together to try and foil the plan. Like I said, yeah, there's lots of, scenarios, and the scenarios all have extra bits depending on which villains are playing them, so that the characters can feel different. And yeah, Batman sneaking off and then appearing and sort of foiling the plan just feels right. And that sort of, Arkham Knight style, take everyone out from a distance is just a good part of the game. Whereas that's not what Harry Potter's about. Like, Harry Potter is a detective series at its best, an adventure series in the middle, or sort of as other parts, a good drama. It's a great drama. It's not, but its action is sort of, you think of the great action scenes in Harry Potter, and it's things like Quidditch scenes, but obviously this isn't a Quidditch game. Or when he solves his problems in the Triwizard Cup, or plays chess, or there's an awful lot of cool stuff that happens, but like, even when he does have big shootouts, with spells, like the spells just sort of hit each other, and then magic stuff happens, rather than we keep hitting each other until I get your hit points down. And then on top of that, like I was saying before, like the how many bad guys do you want to play? Who actually wants to play a game as Death Eaters or Voldemort? Maybe Bellatrix Lestrange you might want to play as, but not really that much. Possibly once you get to people like Draco Malfoy, I might be interested in playing that. See, I wouldn't even really want to play the Basilisk and Tom Riddle. Like, just none of that sounds fun to me. I can understand wanting to play sort of the wizards. Yeah, I feel like that they basically took a whole load of mechanics. I mean, the thing is that this is that the Harry Potter game is made by a miniatures company who have a focus on miniatures games, and I feel like they just went, what are the rules that people use for miniatures games? Now let's apply this to Harry Potter, rather than what's the feel of Harry Potter? How can we apply that to a game? And therefore, that's one of the reasons why I don't think that the Harry Potter one is a big investment and the Batman is, because I think that the Batman game feels like Batman, and I don't feel like that's the same thing with the Harry Potter. I don't think anyone's going to go in 10 years' time, oh, I really wish I had those Harry Potter miniatures game. That was the coolest game ever, and it's impossible to get hold of, and I really want that, because I think that there are better Harry Potter games to come out. There are like Arkham Horror, for example, is a big board game where sort of mystical things happen and you have to investigate. That's sort of what I think Harry Potter would be much better at, going around Hogwarts, investigating, trying to solve things. I'm possibly... See, like, if I was going to do a miniatures game, I'd probably do Quidditch, because there is a big audience out there for those sorts of sports games, and I could see you going, if I'm going to make a fantasy sports game, I may as well do Quidditch, though Quidditch isn't the best game in the world. So I can see those things happening, right? I can easily see someone coming up with better games. Like, if you just really want a Harry Potter board game, there's a deck building game based on Harry Potter that, by all accounts, is passable. I have not played it myself. I think most people have basically accused it of being. I follow a lot of board gamers rather than and I only know their reviews of it. And the argument seems to be it is a very reasonable game, and as far as game makers are concerned, it's nothing special, but it does have the Harry Potter flavour, and deck builders are actually quite a good game, so being an average deck builder is fine, because there is an awful lot of we've done quite well at deck building games, and this isn't games like Magic the Gathering. This is a game where you buy the game and you build a deck as you go through. This is already going on too long and getting way off topic, so I'm going to stop talking about deck building games. That will have to be for another time. But yes, that's why I don't think we're going to have... I do think we will have better Harry Potter games. Arguably, we already have them. I do feel like this might be the best Batman board game we ever get. Mostly because I'm not sure how much better you can get. You can't really go much more complicated than this without it becoming unplayable. And I don't think that you can get much better at this than... I like the role-playing system, and it has a very Batman feel to it. I feel like you could make other games that feel like Batman, but I think this is doing about as good a job as anyone else can do. We can probably equal this, but I don't think we'll necessarily hugely surpass this. In the same way that Arkham Asylum sort of did a pretty perfect job of feeling like Batman, and and the other Arkham games have all been very good and have equaled it, but I don't think that any of them have made you go, oh, Arkham Knight I thought was the essential Batman experience, and in hindsight it doesn't feel like Batman at all. Like, they all just built on that thing, and I feel like we can still have Batman games, like no, I was going to say Injustice, but really playing Injustice does not feel like you're playing as Batman. I believe there are other good games that we can come up with that will feel like Batman, but yeah, I just think this one's a good one. So that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do let me know whether or not this is something that interests you, and if there was a Patreon which either had this as an exclusive or as a... maybe I might do an early thing where the Patreon's a week ahead of everyone else for the podcast. Let me know whether or not it being exclusive would be a deal breaker for you, and let me know your general thoughts on how this was and how I could improve it. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, if there is a next time, we'll see. Bye.